To install Laravel Sanctum, we just go to the Laravel Sanctum documentation and we can directly copy this command and run it to do the installation. So if I just go to my project, composer require Laravel Sanctum. And in fact, you see it did say that nothing to install. That's because Laravel Sanctum is the default authentication that comes when you install Laravel. So it was already installed here, even though I ran the command again. And if we look at the database migrations, we did have a migration called personal access tokens, which is where the personal access tokens will be stored in the backend. So if you have a brand new Laravel application created, you should already have Sanctum installed, but it doesn't hurt to run the command again anyways. Now from there, let's quickly create a controller for login, PHP artisan, make controller, and I'll put that in the auth folder and I'll call it login controller. We also want to create the data and the action. So PHP artisan. Now, because I type PHP artisan a lot in this course, I've created a shortcut in my terminal that allows me to just say PA. So each time you see me do PA, that's a short form for PHP artisan. So PHP artisan, make data, and I'm going to put that in auth, login data. And let's also create the action, PHP artisan, make action, auth, login action. All right, let's start with the data because that is the request we expect from the front end. When users log in, we need two things from them. We need their email address, so public string email, and we need the password, so public string password. And let's validate the data here. So email should be required. It should be an email. And then password should be required. And it should be a string. Okay. So that is all we need for the login data. That's all we expect to get from the user when they try to log into the system. Let's look at the controller. In the login controller, we are going to do public function store method. The store function is basically going to create an access token or a personal access token for the user, which is what we send to the front end for login or for authentication. So this is going to take the request, which is going to be the login data that we just created. And that is all we need to get from the front end. So the token is going to be generated in an action. We're going to use the login action. So login action, run. And to that action, we are going to pass the data that's coming from the request. We don't have that yet. So let's quickly go and build the action. If I could get this to not interrupt me, let's quickly go and build the action for authentication. So the login action takes the login data. And here again, what we want to do is create an access token for the user if they are authenticated or if the information they've provided actually matches their credentials in the database. So the first thing is let's grab the user. So user is equals to user. Again, we're just querying the model where the email equals to whatever email they have provided in their request, okay? And we get the first record out of it. So if there is no user, it means that the email they've provided is not valid or doesn't exist. So if there's no user, or there is a user but the password that they provide doesn't match what we have in the database, so we can compare the password that comes with the request with the password in the database using the hash check method. We want to check a hash of the data that they've provided with what we have in the database. So data, password, we want to compare that with the user password. So we are comparing a hash version of the password that is coming from the request with a hash version of the password that we have in the database. And if any of these conditions is false, then the user's credentials are not valid. It's either the email doesn't exist or the password they've provided doesn't exist. And in that case, we want to throw an exception, which is a validation exception. And we throw that with a message to say, hey, the information you've provided is not correct. And here we can directly access the error message using the translated version that comes with Laravel's language files. You could actually just provide your string here to say the credentials do not match our record. Or you can directly access the message from Laravel's translation files. So it's stored under auth field, which will basically just return the same thing to say, hey, this validation failed. Now, if you want to see all the translation strings that come with Laravel, you can directly publish the language files. So PHP artisan lang publish, and that will publish all the default language files that come with Laravel. And in this case, we are accessing the auth file and the failed string in there. So if you go to the auth and you come here, you see failed, it does say these credentials do not match our records, okay? So we're basically accessing that string by just calling this helper method, the underscore, and then auth failed. Now, if the user authentication goes past this point, which means that we validated that the email exists and that the password they provided matches what we have in the system, then we can directly know that the user is authenticated and we can issue an access token to them. So we just say user create token, and we can give a name to the token. In this case, I'll call it default. And if you wanted to issue multiple authentication tokens to users, let's say you wanted to issue a token and know that it's coming from a mobile device or a web device, a user can have multiple tokens at the same time with different names, and you can directly call a token by its name. In this case, we are just assuming that we're doing a web authentication, and I'll call it default. If we wanted to also use it for mobile authentication, then you can actually pass in as part of your data object the name of the device that you're authenticating, and use that name here in your token, meaning that when you authenticate the user, you can identify and only pull out the token for that device. In this case, I'll just keep it to default, and that returns a hashed token for the user, and we just get the plain text token, which is what we are going to send back to the front end. Now, you may be asking, where are these methods coming from? Where is the create token method coming from? It's coming from a trait that is included in the user model by Laravel Sanctum, and that trait is called has API tokens, okay? So this has API token comes with additional methods on the user model, like tokens, the token's abilities, what the token can do, and this is what we are calling create token. So it will take the user and create a token record with all of this information for that user, and it will return to us the plain text version of that token. So this additional information is all coming from the has API tokens. If you do not see the has API tokens included in your user model, you should do that, but by default, Laravel does include that when it's installed. At this point, the login action has created a token if it's successful, or if the information provided by the user is successful, or it will throw a validation error if the information is not successful. And back in the user controller, we are receiving the token here in case of a successful response. And what we want to do is send the token back to the front end, and by just doing return response JSON, and this will take the token, which is token, and let's just say token type, even though we may not be using this in the front end, and we'll call this bearer token. Okay. Now you can directly use this, send it back to the front end. The front end will receive this data, store the token somehow. It can be stored in the local storage. It can be stored in cookies, in whatever form. When we implement our response, or when we implement our front end, we will be storing this in cookies, but we want that to be stored in what we call HTTP only cookies. And we will look at that when we get to the Nuxt part of things. But for now, let's just say that we want to send this token back to the front end in the form of a cookie, so that when the data is coming back to us, we are also reading it from the cookies or from the headers of the request that the user is sending through. So to send a cookie back with the token, I'm just going to create a cookie object here. So cookie equals cookie, which is a helper method in Laravel for creating cookies. And this method takes the name of the cookie. In this case, I'm just going to call it XSSRF token. You can call it whatever you want. And in fact, because I may be accessing this in other places of the application, I'm going to put that in a configuration file. All right. So let's just create a new configuration file here, and I'll call it site.php, and this will hold our configuration. And here we need to return an array, and I'll just call the first one cookie name, and I'm going to put the cookie name there so that we don't have to manually enter the cookie name each time. So I'm going to copy this into the configuration file. So whenever I need to access a cookie name, I'll simply call it from this configuration file. And over here, we can directly just do config site.cookie name. Okay. Now it also takes the value of the cookie. So in this case, the value should be the token that we generated from the login action and the duration for which that cookie is valid. So the time to live for that cookie stated in minutes. So in this case, I'm just going to say take the current time and add 60 days to it. For instance, if I want my cookie to be valid for 60 days, we can just express here by saying 60 seconds times 60 minutes to give an hour times 24 hours to give a day, and multiply that by the number of days you want this to be valid. In this case, 60. So I'll just say 60 days valid. So when this cookie goes to the front end, it will go with this expiry date, and Laravel or whatever application is using it in the front end will store the cookie with that expiry timestamp, and whenever that time expires, that cookie will be invalidated in the front end, and when we send it back to the back end, Laravel will simply say, hey, this cookie is expired. So that is a cookie object that contains the token that we've generated for the user. Now to send it out with the response, we just simply do cookie and send the cookie value. Okay, so we are going to test this in a minute by logging into the system and see that the cookie was actually set and sent back to the client side. And because we are sending the cookie from the server side, it's going to be stored in the front end in something called HTTP only cookie, which means that client side scripts cannot read the cookie from our browser. It can only be read by a server side script. So let's quickly create a route to implement this login. Going back to our API routes file, we can do route post. And I'm going to call this token. Well, you can call it login if you want. I'm going to call it token because we are issuing a token. And in here, I'm just going to say login controller class, and we want to call the store method. So over in Postman, I already created an endpoint to test the login, which goes to auth token, the endpoint we just created. And let's just put in the parameters to actually log the user in. Now, what you would see here, the way this is set up, is that I have in Postman something called tests, okay? And the test basically sets an environment variable in Postman called token, which will extract the token from the response and store it in an environment variable called token, all right? So you see that when we created our environment here in Postman, we set something called token, which right now doesn't have any value. But what we expect is that if the request is successful and we get a response from the server, we will extract that token from the response and we'll set it in that token environment variable. And then we can use that to send back requests to the server with that token attached. So let's just try to log in here with these invalid credentials. If I go and try and log in, of course, It says the email field is required, the password field is required, which is what we expect. And let's just put in the correct credentials, or actually we'll start with wrong credentials. So the email will be that, and let's just say password. And if we try and log in with this, we do see that it says the credentials do not match our records, which is correct because we are passing the wrong password. But if we put the right password, which is this is my password 123, and we try and log in, then we get the token issued by Laravel in the backend and the token type. Okay, so this is what we expect. This is what we want. If we look at the cookies, you see that the cookie was actually sent back to the front end with the response of that request. The value of the cookie, which is what we got from the response, the domain that the cookie, and this is very important, the domain has to match whatever domain that we have in the back end, and also the expiry date for that cookie. Here we do have HTTP only set to true, which is exactly what we want. Okay, because we don't want client-side scripts again to read this cookie.